My ex-husband got married and invited me to the wedding so I could see how happy he was. I smiled all evening. The next day, his new wife found out that the house they live in actually belongs to me. Good day, dear listeners. It's Diana again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please subscribe to my channel and like this video. And also, let me know in the comments which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. People always say that hindsight is 20/20, that once you look back, everything that was hidden becomes painfully obvious, like a crack in a wall you painted over and chose not to see. I used to be the kind of woman who painted over cracks. I was good at it. Too good. My name is Claire Matthews, or it was, before I took back my maiden name, Anderson. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, the daughter of a high school history teacher and a woman who managed a small accounting firm with the precision of someone who trusted nothing to chance. That practicality skipped me for a while. I thought love was enough to compensate for almost anything. I was wrong, of course. But that lesson cost me 7 years of my life and very nearly my peace of mind. I met Derek Matthews at a mutual friend's barbecue in the summer of 2014. He was charming in the specific way that certain men are charming. Effortlessly, almost carelessly, as though confidence was a coat he had worn so long he'd forgotten he had it on. He laughed easily. He made everyone in the room feel seen. He made me feel seen. By Christmas, we were inseparable. By the following autumn, we were engaged. I was 31 years old, and I believed, with the kind of certainty that only a fool or a person very much in love can feel, that I had made the best decision of my life. We moved into the house on Birchwood Lane 3 months before the wedding. It was a colonial-style house with a wide front porch and a yard that needed work, and I loved it the moment I saw it. The key detail, the detail that would matter enormously 6 years later, is that I bought it myself. My mother had left me a small inheritance when she passed in 2012, and I had spent 2 years watching that money grow in a conservative investment account before I used it as the down payment. The deed was in my name alone. Derek moved in, Derek paid for renovations, Derek grilled on the back patio and called it our house in the way that people casually claim shared ownership over things that belong to someone else. And I never corrected him. Why would I? We were in love. We were getting married. I thought the distinction didn't matter. It mattered. The first crack I painted over appeared in year 3. Derek had started working longer hours at the tech sales firm where he'd recently been promoted. I understood ambition. I respected it. But ambition doesn't explain why a man's phone consistently lights up after 11 at night, or why he begins to lock it in the car when he comes inside. I noticed. I told myself I was being paranoid. I went to therapy. Not couples therapy, just my own, and my therapist at the time gently suggested I was catastrophizing. So I painted over the crack and moved on. The second crack appeared in year 5 in the form of a woman named Britney Cole. She was a new account manager at Derek's company, 28 years old, blonde in the specific highlighted way that requires significant salon maintenance. And she appeared on his LinkedIn with a comment that read, "Great working with you, D," followed by a small emoji that is technically professional and emotionally anything but. I saw it. I said nothing. I painted. By year 6, I had run out of paint. The divorce was filed in March of 2021. Derek was, as he was about most things, strategically gracious. He agreed to the terms quickly, moved out without a scene, and seemed almost relieved, which told me everything I needed to know about how long he had been ready to leave. I stayed in the house on Birchwood Lane. It was mine. The lawyers on both sides agreed without discussion because the deed had never been in question. Then, 6 months later, Derek called me, not texted, called, and asked if he and Britney could move into the house temporarily while they looked for something more permanent. He said it so casually, the way you ask to borrow a sweater. I said yes. God help me. I said yes, because I was still, in some deeply unexamined part of myself, trying to prove I was not the bitter kind of woman. I drew up an informal month-to-month rental arrangement, no written contract, no formal lease, just an understanding between two adults who had once shared a life. And I told myself it would be 3 months at most. That was in October 2021. By June 2023, they were still there. And then Derek sent me a wedding invitation. It arrived in a cream-colored envelope with gold lettering. Derek James Matthews and Britney Nicole Cole request the honor of your presence. Inside, in Derek's handwriting, I recognized the slightly backward slant of his lowercase letters. Was a personal note. Claire, I hope you'll come. I want you to see how happy I am. I stared at that note for a long time. Then I put on the green dress he always said made my eyes look extraordinary, drove 40 minutes to the venue, sat in the 3rd row, and smiled all night. Every time Britney laughed too loudly across the room, I smiled. Every time Derek looked in my direction with that careful, measuring look, the one that was checking to see whether I was devastated, I smiled wider, because I already knew something he didn't. The house where they planned to begin their happy life together still had my name on the deed. I drove home from the wedding at 11:30, still wearing the green dress, and I sat in my parked car in the driveway of my rented apartment for 20 minutes before I could make myself go inside. I want to be honest about what I felt, because it would be easy to reframe that night in retrospect as the moment I became strong and strategic and clear-eyed. The truth is messier. I was angry in the cold, methodical way that comes after anger has already burned through all its heat. I was sad. Not for Derek, not anymore, but for the version of myself who had spent years making herself smaller to fit the shape of what he needed. And underneath both of those feelings, wrapped tight like something coiled, was something I can only describe as recognition. A click, like a key finding the right lock after years of trying the wrong doors. I made tea I didn't drink and sat at my kitchen table with a yellow legal pad, my mother's habit. Whenever something confused or frightened her, she wrote it down. So I wrote. What do I actually have? The house on Birchwood Lane had been purchased in October 2013, 11 months before the wedding. The down payment, $47,000, had come directly from the investment account my mother's estate attorney had set up in my name alone. The mortgage, which I had paid off in full in 2020 after a modest inheritance from my father's side cleared probate, was also in my name. The deed at the Franklin County Recorder's Office listed one owner, Claire Marie Anderson. The house had never been transferred, never been co-signed, never been placed in any joint account or shared title. In the divorce settlement, Derek's attorney had reviewed the property records, confirmed ownership, and moved on to other matters without ceremony. The house wasn't contested because it was never Derek's to contest. I had simply, and here is the part that made me press my pen hard enough into the paper to tear it slightly. I had simply allowed him to live there, with no written lease, no formal agreement, no rent as it happened for the last 8 months because he had told me in a text message last October that he was going through some stuff financially and could he have a grace period, and I, still trying to be the generous, non-bitter woman, had said fine. Did he tell Britney the house was his? Or did she assume? Did she look at the wide front porch and the yard they had landscaped and the kitchen they had repainted a shade of gray I had never approved and think she was building a life on solid ground? I found myself almost sorry for her. Almost. I pulled up the Franklin County Auditor's website at midnight, heart beating oddly, and searched the property address. The result loaded in seconds. Owner, Anderson, Claire M. Assessed value, $387,400. I exhaled slowly. The fear came afterward, as fear usually does, not in the moment of clarity, but in the quiet space after it. Because what was I planning to do exactly? Derek had been my husband. We had shared a life in that house. There were people who would call what I was considering cold or vindictive, or, the word I dreaded most, petty. I could already hear it. He just got married, Claire. Let it go. Move on. Be the bigger person. I had been the bigger person for 7 years and 2 months, and the bigger person had ended up in a 2-bedroom apartment on the east side of Columbus, while her ex-husband and his new wife landscaped her yard and repainted her kitchen and sent her an invitation to watch them celebrate. I picked up the pen again. What do I want? That was harder to answer than the first question. I didn't want to hurt anyone. Or rather, I wanted to be the kind of person who didn't want that, which is not quite the same thing. What I wanted, when I sat with the question long enough, was something quite simple. I wanted what was mine, not out of cruelty, not to ruin anyone's life, but because at some point, maybe the moment I read that note in Derek's backward slanted handwriting, I want you to see how happy I am, I had understood that generosity without boundaries isn't generosity. It's a habit of self-erasure dressed up in polite clothing. The plan, when it began to take shape, was not dramatic. It was the opposite of dramatic. It was practical, legal, and entirely within my rights as a property owner in the state of Ohio. I was going to reclaim my house, not tomorrow, not rashly. I would do it correctly. Through the proper legal channels with documentation and a clear paper trail and the advice of an attorney I could trust. I would give appropriate notice. I would follow every procedural requirement. I would be, as I always had been, the composed, reasonable woman in the room. I just wasn't going to be invisible anymore. I wrote 3 words at the bottom of the legal pad and circled them twice. Call James Harlow. James Harlow was a real estate and property attorney I had worked with when I refinanced the mortgage in 2018. He was methodical, unimpressed by emotional arguments, and exactly the kind of man you want in your corner when you need someone to look at a situation and tell you not what you want to hear, but what is actually true. I set my alarm for 7 and went to bed. For the first time since the divorce papers were signed, I slept through the night. James Harlow's office was on the 14th floor of a glass building downtown, with a view of the Scioto River that looked deliberately calming, like someone had positioned the windows with anxious clients in mind. I arrived at 9:15 on a Monday morning in a gray blazer I had bought for my first post-divorce job interview, carrying the legal pad, a folder containing every document I had thought to print, and the particular kind of composure that comes from having decided something irrevocable. James was in his late 50s, with the measured cadence of a man who had spent decades listening to people explain complicated situations and then quietly organizing those complications into actionable steps. He let me talk for 12 uninterrupted minutes. Then he looked at the documents I had laid across his desk: the deed, the original purchase agreement, the mortgage satisfaction letter from 2020, the text messages from Derek requesting the rent grace period, and he folded his hands. "Mrs. Anderson." "Ms., I said. I've gone back to my maiden name. He nodded once, accepting the correction without comment. Ms. Anderson, based on what you've shown me, your ownership position is unambiguous. The property at Birchwood Lane has been and remains solely in your name. The occupants, your former husband and his current wife, have no lease agreement, no documented right of occupancy, and no claim of any kind to the property under Ohio law. I had known this. I had told myself this at midnight over a legal pad, but hearing it from James Harlow in his 14th floor office felt different. It felt like gravity. What does that mean practically? I asked. It means you can issue a formal notice to vacate, he said, under Ohio Revised Code. Since there is no written lease and the month-to-month arrangement was informal and unwritten, you are required to give 30 days notice. I would recommend we do this formally. A written notice, certified mail, return receipt requested, hand-delivered simultaneously if possible. Clean paper trail. And if they refuse to leave, then we file for eviction. The process takes approximately 30 to 60 additional days through the municipal court, assuming they don't contest it substantively, and they have no legal grounds to contest it substantively. He paused. I should ask, is there any documentation of the rental arrangement? Anything in writing that could be construed as a lease? I thought of the text messages, the October exchange where Derek had asked for a grace period on rent, and I had said fine. That acknowledged a financial arrangement which might complicate things, but James reviewed them and shook his head slightly. An informal text exchange acknowledging that rent existed, with no amount specified, no term specified, no written agreement. It confirmed an at-will tenancy, nothing more. There's one more thing, James said. He pulled up the Franklin County Auditor's records on his computer and turned the screen toward me. I want to make sure you're aware of this. The property taxes on this address have continued to be assessed to your name. Have you been paying them? I nodded. Every year, through auto pay on the account my accountant manages. Good. That's additional documentation of continuous ownership and financial responsibility. This is a clean case, Ms. Anderson. If you want to proceed, we can have the notice prepared today. I looked at the river through the window for a moment. 14 floors below, Columbus moved through an ordinary Monday morning, oblivious. Prepare it, I said. What I didn't know, while James was drafting the notice in the adjacent room and his paralegal was making certified mail arrangements, was that Derek had already felt the first tremor. He told me this much later, in one of the practical, unavoidable phone conversations that the subsequent legal process required, that he had called me the morning after the wedding to check in, and when I hadn't answered, something in his chest had shifted. He said he couldn't explain it. I believe him. Derek was many things, but he was not unperceptive. He had lived with me for 6 years. He knew the difference between my ordinary silences and the kind of silence that means a woman has stopped explaining herself to you because she no longer needs to. Britney, by all accounts, was less attuned to subtlety. According to what I pieced together afterward from multiple sources, she spent the day after the wedding, her first official day as Mrs. Matthews, reorganizing the master bedroom closet and making plans to convert the second guest room into a home office. She had told Derek the week before that she wanted to repaint the exterior in the spring. She'd already chosen the color, a deep navy with white trim. She had not asked me. She had not needed to, as far as she knew. On Tuesday morning, James's paralegal hand-delivered the certified envelope to the front door of the house on Birchwood Lane at 10:45 a.m. The return address was the law office. Derek signed for it himself. I know this because the postal confirmation came to my email at 11:03. Delivered. Signature obtained. I was at my desk at work when the notification arrived. I read it once, then closed the tab and went back to the report I was editing. My phone began to ring at 11:17. Derek's name on the screen. I let it ring. There are moments that are genuinely irreversible. Not because of what happens, but because of what you choose not to do. Not answering that call was one of them. I could have picked up. I could have explained, softened, hedged, offered some version of compromise that would have made everyone more comfortable in the short term and cost me the house in the long term. I let it ring until it stopped. Then I saved the call log, took a screenshot of the time and date, and emailed it to James. The point of no return, I have come to understand, is rarely a dramatic moment. It is usually a Tuesday morning. It is usually a phone ringing while you sit very still and choose, clearly and finally, not to reach for it. Derek called 11 more times that Tuesday. I know the exact number because I counted them later, scrolling through my call log with the methodical attention to detail my mother had always encouraged and my ex-husband had always found exhausting. 11 calls. No voicemails until the 8th, and when he finally left one, his voice had the particular quality of a man who is still deciding which version of himself to deploy, the reasonable one or the other one. Claire, I don't know what this is, but I think we need to talk. Call me back. Please. Please. The word did something small and involuntary to a part of me I had thought was completely finished with him. I acknowledged the feeling, let it pass, and forwarded the voicemail to James as documentation of continued contact following legal notice. The second voicemail came 2 hours later. The reasonable version had been retired. I don't know what kind of game you're playing, but I want you to know that this is going to be a problem. We have been living in this house for nearly 2 years. You cannot just send a letter. I'm going to call my lawyer. By all means, I thought. Call your lawyer. His lawyer, as it turned out, was a general practice attorney named Fowler, who handled mostly small business contracts and had, according to James, a limited background in residential property law. Fowler called James on Wednesday afternoon. James called me afterward and summarized the conversation in his economical way. Fowler had argued that the length of occupancy created an implied tenancy, that Derek had made significant improvements to the property, and that the notice was therefore invalid. James had listened politely and then cited 3 specific Ohio statutes that resolved each point in approximately 90 seconds. There had been a pause. Then Fowler had said he would need to consult with his client. They have nothing, James told me. This is posturing. Expect them to make it personal before they accept the legal reality. He was right, as he usually was. The personal phase began on Thursday evening. I was leaving the grocery store with 2 bags when I turned to find Derek standing at the trunk of my car. He had always been tall, 6'2", the kind of height that in certain lights had felt like shelter and in others felt like pressure. Standing in the parking lot of a Kroger on a Thursday evening in June, hands in the pockets of his jacket, he looked like neither. He looked like a man who had driven to a grocery store parking lot to confront his ex-wife, which is to say he looked diminished by the specificity of the situation. "You could have called me back," he said. "I could have," I agreed. I pressed the button to open my trunk and began loading the bags. "This is insane, Claire. You know that, right? We're living there. We've been there for 2 years. Britney has... We've made this our home." I lifted the second bag, set it down carefully. "You've been living in my home, Derek. There's a difference. I put $15,000 into that kitchen renovation." "You did," I said. "And you did that as a tenant, without a written agreement on a property you knew was in my name. I have emails from you acknowledging the arrangement." He stared at me. I told you we were having financial issues. You said you weren't in a hurry. And then you got married, I said, and invited me to the wedding to show me how happy you were. So things improved. I closed the trunk. You'll receive all the proper notices through James. I'd recommend getting an attorney who specializes in residential property law. 30 days goes faster than you think. I got in the car. He stood in the parking lot for a moment. I watched him in the rearview mirror. And then he pulled out his phone. I drove away at a normal, unhurried speed. That night, Britney sent me a message through Instagram, which I had apparently forgotten to block. The message was long. It covered a range of topics. My bitterness, my inability to let go, the allegedly suspicious timing of the notice relative to their wedding, and her belief that I was doing this specifically to hurt her, a woman I barely knew, out of jealousy over a man who had chosen her. The message ended with a threat, loosely worded, the kind that probably felt powerful in the composing and would embarrass her later, that she had friends in real estate law and I would regret this. I screenshotted the message and emailed it to James. Then I blocked her account. Over the following week, there were 2 more escalation attempts. A call from an unknown number, Derek borrowing a phone, that I declined and documented. A visit from a man who introduced himself as Derek's business associate, who knocked on my apartment door on a Saturday morning and asked if I might reconsider, as the situation was creating a great deal of stress for the family. I asked him to step back from my door, filmed 30 seconds of the encounter on my phone, and told him that all communication should go through my attorney. He left. I emailed the video to James. Each attempt, I noticed, made me calmer rather than more agitated. The escalation was proof that they understood the strength of my position. Frightened people escalate. Confident people don't need to. James filed the formal paperwork on day 28 of the 30-day notice period, in anticipation of non-compliance. The filing was procedural, not adversarial, just preparation. But the timestamp mattered. Every step had a timestamp. That was the architecture of this, I had come to understand. Not drama, not confrontation, but documentation and patience, laid down in sequence like stone. On the Saturday after the filing, I drove 2 hours to my college friend Sarah's lake house in Knox County. I spent 3 days doing very little, reading, walking along the water in the early morning, eating dinner at the picnic table on the porch. On the second night, Sarah opened a bottle of wine and asked me how I was actually doing. I think, I said, that I am becoming the kind of person I always should have been. She raised her glass. The water reflected the last of the evening light. About time, she said. I came back from the lake on Tuesday. The apartment felt quieter than it had before, the way rooms sometimes feel after you've returned from somewhere with open sky. I made coffee, unpacked, and sat at my kitchen table for 20 minutes without doing anything in particular, just existing in the space, which was mine, which had always been mine, without anyone else's expectations pressing into the walls. James had emailed while I was gone. Derek's attorney Fowler had requested a 30-day extension. James had declined on my behalf. I replied to James's email with 2 words, good, proceed. Then Derek called again. This time I answered because James had advised me that it was legally prudent to maintain documented evidence of good faith communication, and because I had, by that point, reached the altitude of calm where other people's distress no longer altered my own weather. I want to make you an offer, Derek said. He had prepared himself. His voice was measured, the negotiating voice I recognized from the years when he sold software packages to reluctant clients. Hear me out before you say anything. I said nothing, which he took as an invitation to continue. "I'll buy the house from you," he said. "Fair market value. I'll have it appraised. We'll use an independent appraiser, your choice, and I'll pay you whatever the appraisal comes in at. No lawyers, no courts, no drama. We handle it like adults, like people who once cared about each other, and everyone walks away clean." The offer was not unreasonable, as offers go. The house had been appraised informally at $387,000 by the county. At current market, it was probably worth closer to $410,000, perhaps $420,000 with the kitchen renovation factored in. It was real money. It would have been, in a very narrow sense, the path of least resistance. "Why?" I asked. A pause. "Why what? Why do you want this resolved quickly? You have 30 days, or rather, you have fewer now, before the eviction filing proceeds. Your attorney has reviewed the case. You know where you stand legally, so why offer to buy instead of fighting it?" I waited. Because Britney doesn't know. The silence on his end of the line was the most honest thing Derek had communicated to me in years. "She doesn't know the house is in my name," I said. Not a question. "She thinks it's yours, or she thinks it's something you're in the process of buying, or she thinks there's some explanation that doesn't involve the fact that you've been living in your ex-wife's house, rent-free for 8 months, without telling her." I let that sit for a moment. "Which is it, Derek?" "Claire." "I'm going to decline your offer," I said pleasantly. "If you'd like to put something in writing, you're welcome to have your attorney contact mine. But I'd encourage you to spend the time preparing to vacate rather than negotiating. Goodbye." I ended the call, wrote a summary of the conversation in a Word document with the date, time, and my recollection of the exact language, saved it, and emailed it to James. Then I sat back and noticed, with some curiosity, that I felt nothing in particular. Not triumph, not guilt, not the dull ache that had accompanied every Derek-related decision for years. Just clarity, the clean, functional absence of confusion. The social support arrived in a form I hadn't anticipated. I had told almost no one about the situation. By temperament, I am private about things that matter to me, and by judgment, I understood that the fewer people who knew the details before the process concluded, the cleaner everything would be. But Sarah had, with my permission, mentioned to 3 of our mutual friends that I was going through something property-related with Derek, and the response had been more substantial than I expected. Maya, who had been a bridesmaid at my wedding and now practiced family law in Cleveland, texted me a long message that ended with, "You own the house." He never did. "And Ohio law is entirely on your side. Call me if you need a second opinion on anything James does, but it sounds like he knows what he's doing." Patrice, who had known Derek slightly longer than she'd known me and had formed opinions she'd kept tactfully to herself for years, called and said simply, "I just want you to know that I always thought he was a little too comfortable taking things that weren't exactly his." And Tom, my neighbor in the apartment building, a retired contractor in his 60s who left coffee outside my door during the worst week of the divorce and had been a quiet, steady presence ever since, knocked one evening with a bag of takeout and said, "I heard you're handling something difficult. You don't have to tell me anything, but I made enough for 2. I fed him Thai food and told him the whole story, and he listened the way certain older men listen, without interruption or advice. And at the end, he said, "You know what your mother would say." "Document everything," I said. He nodded. "Document everything." Sitting at that table in my apartment with a container of pad thai and a friend who had shown up with food on the difficult evenings of the last 3 years, I thought, this is the support I had been building without fully recognizing it. Not dramatic, not organized, just people who showed up. Derek and Britney had a new house and a new marriage, and presumably friends who were congratulating them on their beautiful wedding photographs. I had Tom and Maya and Patrice and Sarah. I felt, taking a clear-eyed inventory, that I had the better end of that arrangement. 14 days remained on the formal notice when Britney came to my apartment. I want to be precise about this, because the visit has a specific quality in my memory. The quality of something that was designed to look like one thing while being entirely another. She called first, which surprised me. I didn't know she had my number, and the thought of Derek providing it to her, the quiet domestic transaction of a husband sharing his ex-wife's contact information with his new wife, E., produced a feeling I didn't care to examine. "I'd like to come and talk," she said. Her voice was different from the Instagram message, softer, younger sounding. Just the two of us, woman to woman, no lawyers, no Derek. I think there are things that have gotten lost in all of this, and I want to talk to you. I thought about it for exactly long enough to avoid seeming eager. "Come Thursday at 6, I said. "I'll have an hour." She arrived with a small bunch of flowers, tulips, yellow and cream, and wearing an outfit that had been selected with an attention to impression I recognized because I had once operated the same way. She was striking. I registered without particular feeling. Younger than I had expected, up close. 28 had become 29 by now, but she had the specific luminousness of someone who had never doubted that the world would arrange itself around her. I put the flowers in water because it was the polite thing to do. I made tea neither of us wanted. We sat at the kitchen table. "I want to start by saying I understand why you're angry," she began. "I'm not angry," I said. She paused. This was not what she had prepared for. "Well, hurt then. I know this situation has been hard." "The situation isn't hard," I said. "It's straightforward. You're living in a house that belongs to me. I've issued proper legal notice. The process is proceeding as it should. But that's what I want to talk about." She leaned forward slightly, an intimate gesture, calibrated to produce intimacy. "We've spent 2 years in that house. We've made it a home. Derek loves that house. We both do. And I understand that maybe this feels like a way to have some control over a situation where you felt you lost control." "What situation?" I asked. She blinked. The divorce." "I didn't lose control of the divorce," I said. "I initiated it. I signed the papers. I kept the house, my house, and offered your husband a place to stay as a temporary arrangement while he found his footing. That arrangement has now concluded." The softness shifted, very slightly, the way a photograph shifts when the light in a room changes. That's a very cold way to look at it. It's an accurate way to look at it. "Claire." She set her tea down. "Can I be honest with you? Please. I think you're doing this because of me, because Derek chose me. And I think if you examine your own feelings honestly, you know that a part of this, a part of what you're doing, is about making us suffer, making our beginning painful." She held eye contact steadily. She was good at this. "And I think if you're a fair person, you have to ask yourself, is that who you want to be?" The question settled between us like a card being placed on a table. I looked at her for a moment. She was intelligent, I thought. This was a well-constructed move. Take a legally vulnerable position and reframe it as a moral one. Redirect the narrative from ownership to motivation, because motivations are murky and property deeds are not. "Britney," I said carefully, "I want you to hear me clearly. This is not about you. It's not about Derek choosing you. Derek and I ended 3 years ago, and I made my peace with it. This is about a house that I bought, that I paid off, that remains in my name, and that I allowed Derek to occupy informally on the understanding that it was temporary. The temporary arrangement has lasted 2 years. I have the legal right to reclaim my property. I'm exercising it. I picked up my tea. I hope that's clear. The softness finished shifting. Underneath it was something harder. Not ugly, but uncompromising. The face of someone who had expected to win this and was recalculating. "You know what I think?" she said. Her voice had changed completely now, all the managed gentleness gone. "I think you've been waiting for this. I think the whole time you let us stay there, you were just watching, building your little file, waiting for the right moment to pull the rug out. The wedding was it. You couldn't stand watching him be happy, so you decided to—" "The notice was filed through my attorney on the Monday after the wedding," I said. "I spent that weekend deciding whether to proceed. Derek and I had a standing issue with the informal tenancy well before the wedding. The timing is what it is." I stood. "I think we've covered everything that's useful to cover. I'll show you out." She stood slowly. At the door, she turned back. "You think this makes you strong," she said. "You think this makes you winning. But what you're actually doing is making sure Derek hates you, and I hate you, and everyone who knows you will know what kind of person does this to a newlywed couple." "Then they'll know," I said. "Good night, Britney." I closed the door. I stood in the hallway of my apartment for a full minute after the latch clicked, one hand on the wall. I am going to be honest. I was afraid. Not of her specifically, but of what she had named. The social cost, the reputation, the way a story can be told in 2 directions, and which direction it goes depends almost entirely on who speaks louder and who gets there first. The fear was real. I acknowledged it. And then I noticed something. It had not, for a single moment, made me want to stop. Fear is not the opposite of resolve. I had believed that once. Now I understood they could exist in the same body, simultaneously, and the one that guides your actions is the one you choose to act from. I went to my desk, opened the Word document, and wrote a detailed summary of every word Britney had said. Then I emailed it to James, with one note at the bottom: "No change in course. Continue as planned." The eviction hearing was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in late August at the Franklin County Municipal Court, 3rd floor, courtroom 9B. It was not a dramatic room. It had the practical, fluorescent quality of a place where consequences are administered routinely and without ceremony, which is, I have come to believe, exactly the right atmosphere for the administration of consequences. James had advised me that the hearing would likely take less than an hour. Derek's attorney Fowler had filed an opposition brief that James characterized as inventive but unpersuasive. There were 3 arguments. First, that the length of occupancy had created an implied tenancy with assumed renewal rights. Second, that Derek's renovation expenditures constituted an equitable interest in the property. And third, and this one had taken me a moment to process without laughing, that the verbal understanding between Derek and myself had constituted a verbal lease of indefinite term, which could not be terminated without mutual consent. Ohio law addressed each of these arguments with the bluntness of statutes that do not have feelings about the parties involved. I wore a navy blazer and brought a folder containing 37 pages of documentation arranged in chronological order. Tom had driven me. Sarah had sent a text at 7:45 a.m. that read simply, "You have this." I had read it in the car and put my phone away. Derek and Britney were already in the corridor when I arrived. Derek in a suit I recognized, charcoal gray, bought during our marriage for job interviews. And Britney, in a silk blouse that made her look, I thought, like someone going to a business lunch rather than a legal proceeding. She did not look at me when I walked in. Derek did, briefly, and in his expression was a calculation I recognized. How do I make this go the way I need it to go? I looked at the wall behind him and went to find James. The presiding magistrate was a woman named Rosalind Okafor, who reviewed the filing documents with the brisk efficiency of someone who had sat through several hundred property hearings and was not susceptible to narrative. Fowler opened with the implied tenancy argument. Magistrate Okafor asked him, with genuine pleasantness, to cite the Ohio statute supporting a verbal implied tenancy with renewal rights in the absence of any written agreement. He cited a case. She asked him to read the specific language of the applicable section. He did. The language did not say what he needed it to say. She moved on without comment. The renovation expenditure argument produced a slightly longer exchange. Fowler argued that Derek's $15,000 investment in kitchen renovations demonstrated an implied expectation of long-term occupancy. James responded that under Ohio law, improvements made by a tenant to a property they do not own are the property of the owner upon the tenancy's conclusion, and that any financial claims Derek might have regarding renovation costs were a separate civil matter unrelated to the eviction proceeding before the court. Magistrate Okafor agreed and moved on. And then, in the middle of Fowler's third argument, the verbal lease of indefinite term, Britney spoke. I do not know, to this day, whether her attorney advised her to do what she did. It did not look advised. It looked like a person who had been sitting in a hard chair for 40 minutes, watching their anticipated life be systematically dismantled by paperwork and statute citations, and losing, finally, the ability to remain quiet. Your Honor, she said, standing partially, not quite out of her chair, not quite fully standing, a posture that captured perfectly the unpreparedness of the moment. I need to say something, because I don't think the court has the full picture. Magistrate Okafor looked at her with measured patience. You'll have an opportunity to provide testimony at the appropriate time. Please be seated. It's just... Britney's voice was tight. She allowed us to move in. She said we could stay. No one told me the house wasn't. I thought Derek. She stopped. The room held very still. It is a particular kind of silence, the silence that occurs when a person realizes in public that the foundational understanding on which they have been operating is incorrect. I have heard it described, the intake of breath, the fractional pause before the face rearranges. I had imagined it many times in the months since the wedding. The reality was quieter than I had expected and sadder than I had wanted it to be. Britney turned slowly and looked at Derek. Derek looked at the table. Derek. Her voice had changed entirely. Whose house is it? Britney. Whose house is it? Fowler put a hand on Derek's arm. James glanced at me once. Magistrate Okafor was watching the exchange with the attentiveness of someone who has seen many things happen in courtroom 9B and finds the range of human behavior consistently instructive. The deed of ownership, James said, addressing Magistrate Okafor with calm precision, has been in my client's name since the date of purchase in October 2013. We have submitted the original deed, the mortgage satisfaction documentation from 2020, and continuous property tax payment records as Exhibits A through F. Ownership has never been in question or dispute. The only matter before this court is the timing and execution of the vacate notice, which was issued correctly, formally, and in compliance with all applicable Ohio law. He paused. There has been no claim of co-ownership by the respondents at any prior stage of this proceeding, he added, with the mild precision of someone completing a sentence that does not need to be dramatic because the facts are dramatic enough. Because there is no basis for one. Derek said something to Britney in a low voice. She pulled her arm away from him. "Mr. Fowler," said Magistrate Okafor, "does your client have any documentation that disputes the ownership status of the property as filed by the petitioner?" Fowler paused precisely long enough for the absence of an answer to function as an answer. "No, Your Honor." "Does your client have a written lease agreement signed by both parties with specific terms of occupancy?" "No, Your Honor." "Does your client have any document establishing a right of occupancy on the property in question beyond the informal, verbal, month-to-month arrangement acknowledged in prior communications?" "No, Your Honor." "Then I'm going to rule on the motion." She ruled in my favor. I want to be clear about how it felt, because I think honesty is more useful than performance. It did not feel like triumph. It felt like completion, the way it feels to put down a very heavy thing you have been carrying without fully realizing how heavy it was. I looked at the table in front of me. James made a note in his file. Across the room, Britney sat with her arms folded and her eyes fixed on a point above the doorway, and she did not look at Derek at all. Derek, when I finally let myself look at him, appeared smaller. Not physically, just the specific compression of a person who has run out of alternatives and is standing in the new shape of his situation, trying to find the edges of it. I collected my folder, thanked James quietly, and walked out of courtroom 9B into the fluorescent corridor. Tom was in the waiting area, reading a magazine he had brought from home. He looked up. "Well?" he said. "We're done," I said. He put the magazine in his coat pocket and stood. "Thai food?" "Tom," I said. "Yes, absolutely yes." The court order set the final vacate date for September 19th. 21 days for Derek and Britney to remove themselves and their belongings from the house on Birchwood Lane. James filed the executed order with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office, which would conduct a formal inspection on that date and, if necessary, execute a formal removal. Everything was now in the hands of the process, which moves at its own pace and does not negotiate. I learned afterward, through the small-town geometry of a city where everyone knows someone who knows someone, that the weeks following the ruling were difficult in the house on Birchwood Lane. Britney had not known prior to the hearing that the house was not Derek's. Whatever version he had provided her, whether he had told her it was his outright or simply let a comfortable misunderstanding persist without correcting it, the hearing had ended it. The ending, by the accounts I received, was not quiet. 2 moving trucks appeared outside the house on the 15th of September, 4 days before the deadline. By the 17th, the property had been vacated. The sheriff's deputy who conducted the inspection found the house empty and in acceptable condition. James forwarded the formal clearance documentation with a single line. "Property is yours, Ms. Anderson. Congratulations." I drove to the house on a Saturday morning in late September, when the Ohio light is amber and slanted and makes ordinary things look considered. I parked on the street and sat in the car for a moment before going in. The porch needed repainting. The kitchen was indeed gray, a cool, sophisticated gray that I would have, if anyone had bothered to ask, probably chosen myself. I stood in it for a while. The house smelled different than it had when I left. Someone else's life had moved through it and moved out again. But underneath, faint and persistent, was something I recognized. the particular silence of rooms I knew. I opened the back door and stood on the patio. The yard stretched out, still green in the September warmth. The rose corner needed cutting back. The fence post on the south side was still wobbling as it had been for years. I made a list on my phone. Fence post, porch paint, back garden. The formal legal matters concluded cleanly. Derek filed a civil claim for $15,000 representing the kitchen renovation costs. James's response was thorough. Under Ohio law, improvements made by a tenant without a written agreement granting renovation rights are the property of the owner upon vacating. The claim was dismissed. James billed me $4,800 in total legal fees. I paid it the same day the invoice arrived. On a Friday evening in November, I lit a fire in the fireplace of the house on Birchwood Lane and ate takeout on the floor because the couch hadn't been delivered yet, reading a book I'd been meaning to start for 3 years. I did not feel victorious. I felt, very simply, at home. 2 years have passed since I stood on that porch with a key that never left my keychain. What followed was less dramatic and more valuable than any version I could have scripted. I repainted the porch with Sarah over an October weekend. It's the color of warm cream now, and I like it better than anything I'd imagined. The rose corner was replanted, and by May was producing in a way that made me stop every morning on my way to the car. Professionally, the energy I had spent managing the emotional logistics of a failing marriage went to work instead. I was promoted. I led a project I would previously have thought beyond me and discovered it wasn't. I am also, cautiously, in a relationship with a man named Marcus, who has nothing to prove and asks specific questions because he pays attention. We are taking our time. As for Derek and Britney, I know what I know through mutual acquaintances without seeking it. After the eviction, they moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the west side. Britney had believed Derek was in a stronger financial position than he was, a picture built partly on the absence of rent expenses he had enjoyed for 2 years. When that fell away, other things fell away with it. 14 months after the wedding, she apparently consulted a divorce attorney. Derek changed jobs twice. The last I heard, they were separated and living in the same apartment without speaking much. I don't recount this with pleasure. I note it as the natural consequence of choices, his, hers, and once upon a time, mine. What I have now is a house I can walk through in the early morning, a career producing results I'm proud of, friends who show up, and myself, which sounds simple and is the hardest one thing on the list.